Welcome to Brookings. My name is Ron Haskins. I co-direct a center here called the Center on Children and Families with Richard Reeves. A great pleasure to work with Richard. And we're here to mark the 25th volume in the Future Children that the Brookings Princeton team has published. It's been a great pleasure. We're now in our 13th year, and I think we've published many good volumes, including this one. This volume contains 9 splendid papers that address social and emotional learning, a relatively new but growing field in education. Here's our plan for the morning. First, we're going to begin with an overview of the entire volume, so things that we're not going to talk about later necessarily, but all the papers in the volume, and because we want you to have a flavor of what's in the volume. And then we'll follow Stephanie Jones from Harvard. She is she's the Maris and Max Cargman Professor in Human Development at Harvard. Did I say that right? Yeah. Close? Yeah. Close. You learn to be close is good enough for me. All right, so then when that's through, we're going to hear about the policy brief. We always do a policy brief, 3,000 words. Both of the volume and the policy brief are available for you, as is biographical information, so most of the introductions will be quite short. And the policy brief was written by Clark McCown, who also authored a chapter in the volume, and he's executive director of the Rush Neural Behavior Center in Skokie, Illinois, just outside Chicago. And as I said, he was the author of the policy brief. The keynote speech by Dr. Timothy Shriver will follow, and I'll introduce Dr. Shriver at that time. After some discussion with Clark and Tim and an opportunity for audience questions, we'll turn to a panel discussion that will include, in addition to Clark and Stephanie, 2 new speakers, Emily Doolittle, who is the co-editor along with Stephanie of the volume, and she's the team lead for social behavioral research at the famous and glorified Institute of Education Sciences that we all know and love, whose first director is here, Grover Whitehurst, that many of you probably know him. And then second, Roger Weisberg, who's the UIC and LAS Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Education at the University of Illinois. And we'll then conclude with a discussion with the audience and adjourn the event. So I now welcome Stephanie to the podium, and we'll see if you actually have a PowerPoint.
It's right here.
It'll be very good if you do.
I do have a PowerPoint.
Well, but the question is it loaded?
And here it is. I have a PowerPoint addiction, I should say, which is why I have a PowerPoint, a late-breaking PowerPoint. So, welcome. Thank you for coming today. We're really excited about this issue. Let's see if I can work the PowerPoint. So, my job is to introduce the issue, and I thought I would do that by covering 2 major areas. And I'm not going to actually give you kind of a summary of each paper. I'm going to do something that I want to do, which is tell you what we had intended to do and a little bit about why, and then tell you what we did, and then highlight some things from the issue in general. And then you'll have to read the whole thing, which is our intention. So in terms of highlights, I'm going to focus on what is it, which is a question that we ask ourselves a great deal in this area. I'm going to summarize what we know about what works, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's next. So before we begin, of course, I want to thank everyone involved, in particular our funders, the Wallace Foundation, and of course the Future of Children and the Brookings Institution, without whom some people in the room, many people not in the room, none of this would have happened, including a terrific authors conference a year ago, all of the editorial work, and then of course putting on this event today. And I also want to thank all of the authors, some of whom are here, many of whom are not, the co-authors, the discussants, the reviewers, the research assistants. They are very important to this endeavor and frequently not thanked, so thank you to them. So I'm going to start by talking about the moment we're in. And as Clark says in his brief, the SEL project is nearing a critical moment. It's a little dramatic, but I think it's right. We have 2 decades at least of research on the topic, a great many effective approaches designed for schools, preschools, and out-of-school settings. A number of major initiatives, many led by CASEL, including their Collaborating Districts Initiative, a Collaborating States Initiative, and we now have a National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. So, as these headlines suggest, the worlds of practice and policy are responding. Every time I do the Google, which everybody should do, social and emotional learning, a whole host of new headlines and new things come up, some of them just last week. And this, of course, is a tiny, tiny selection. So our intention at this pivotal moment was to design a volume for a broad audience that provides a number of things. A clear view of definition and operationalization of what is meant by SEL, and one that positions the field in a broader landscape. A concrete and distilled summary of evidence from interventions in early education, elementary school, middle and high school, and out-of-school time settings or after school. And then we wanted to highlight connections between research and practice and in SEL and a number of key policy areas in education. So that's what we plan to do. This is what we did. We have a paper in the issue by Mark Greenberg and a number of co-authors that positions or locates SEL in the broader landscape of public health and education. We have 4 papers that summarize the evidence from interventions across developmental periods and across settings. And we have a number of papers, 3, that link SEL to key policy areas, including school discipline, teacher preparation and support, and standards, assessment, and accountability. So we tried to provide a kind of a concrete, clear, distilled summary that captures the boundaries of this field. And the boundaries really begin with how do we understand what it is and what it means, and ends with how do we think about policies that make a difference for it, which is the goal of this session today. So now to the highlights. I go to a lot of meetings like this, and I sit in a room with a lot of people, and we talk about this field, and usually the first question in the room is, okay, what is it? What are we actually talking about? And often it's the last question in the meeting as well. And so what we've tried to do is not provide one definition, but to acknowledge a whole set of definitions that distill down to, I think, a number of concrete elements. So the truth of the field is that a whole variety of disciplines have produced a great many frameworks and organizational systems that describe and define social and emotional skills. These frameworks describe this domain in terms of skills and competencies, but also other things like behaviors and attitudes and traits, strengths and abilities. So how do we define the boundaries of this area? I put in here 2 general definitions. You can find a lot of general definitions, and they kind of cohere around a number of key elements. 2 I like, one from this issue from Clark. Social and emotional learning, or SEL, refers to the thinking skills, behavioral skills, and regulatory skills needed to interact effectively with others and to make, form, and deepen relationships. Another from the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development is when social, emotional, and academic development, which is what that SEED stands for, goes well, children develop the skills to manage and take care of themselves, get along and work well within their learning community, and 3, engage in academic learning. So those are great general definitions. What I spend a lot of time working on is trying to go underneath that and get a little concrete about what is actually meant. So what are the skills we'd like to see in children in settings over time? So what is it specifically? The domain includes a set of very concrete cognitive, emotional, and social skills that support learning, positive behavior, and high-quality interaction. So these are sort of skills and competencies, things that you have and can do. And you can maybe read those, but in the cognitive area, we have things like managing and shifting attention, controlling impulses, planning and goal setting, critical thinking. In the emotion area, we have things like emotion knowledge and expression, emotion and behavioral regulation, empathy. In the social category, we have things like understanding social cues, so being able to read and respond to the social environment, social perspective taking, so leaping into the shoes of another person and understanding a situation from their viewpoint, pro-social, cooperative behavior, effective conflict resolution, social problem solving, and so on. What's often left out, and I think this is where it gets a little complicated, is that there's another set of factors that represent what I think Clark said maybe 10 years ago, describes as the belief ecology, which I love that term. And it represents a set of internal or maybe contextual guides that drive action based on the knowledge, skills, and dispositions you have. So it may not actually be enough to have the skill. You have to be free, safe, and motivated to use it when it matters. And so these include things like beliefs, knowledge of self and identity, self-efficacy, growth mindset, agency, self-esteem, self-knowledge. In the kind of character and values domain, we have ethical, performance, intellectual, and civic values. Some call them virtues. And in the personality category, we have things that we know well, like optimism, gratitude, openness, enthusiasm, and so on. These are the words that you hear embedded in this field when you look at the literature. So moving from what is it to what works, there is a whole lot of evidence of different types now accumulated over 30 or 40 years, the majority of it in the last 2 decades. We have long-term correlational studies that link skills in early childhood to life outcomes 20 or 30 years later, even after accounting for all sorts of stuff in the middle. We have large multi-program studies. We have trials of specific interventions implemented in preschool settings, in elementary school, middle school, high school, and in after-school contexts, many of them, most of them, randomized trials. And then, of course, as the evidence accumulates, we have a number of meta-analyses and cost-benefit analyses. What's the bottom line from all of this evidence? There's solid and accumulating evidence for the benefit of interventions implemented in preschool, elementary school, middle and high school, and in out-of-school time settings. The evidence, in my view, suggests some sort of common denominators of practice of effective programs that include adults who model and live the skills we expect in children, who make the skills quite explicit to children, who make it very clear what the skills are, who give children opportunities to practice, fail, practice, and learn again in all interactions and settings. And I would say that the strongest evidence is for individual interventions, so interventions that are carefully designed around a particular target, so a particular outcome, that is aligned with a very specific set of practices, and then critically, and this will come up later, aligned with a set of measurement tools. Across those individual intervention studies, there are meta-analytic studies that aggregate the data and confirm what we know from those individual studies. A couple of considerations that are quite important. The whole set of skills are developmental. So I'm a developmental psychologist. I care deeply about human development. I see human development in everything I do. So an intervention that's designed for a 5-year-old or even for a 6th grader isn't necessarily going to be the right intervention for a 9th grader or a 12th grader. So we have to think about development and developmental contexts when we think about interventions. The second important consideration is, of course, always, as with any educational intervention, implementation. So programs are most effective when they are implemented well. So thinking about the key contexts and supports for implementation is essential. So finally, what's next? I think that the next frontier for this field, building on this volume, is to think really carefully about this idea of integration. How do we weave social and emotional learning as a set of practices, beliefs, targets into the fabric of schools and schooling? This means thinking about core practices that are embedded in everyday interactions. It also means linking to existing structures in schools, like discipline practices. And in the journal, there's a paper on this by Anne Gregory. It's impossible to integrate practices without thinking about adults. So I think the next generation of this work really focuses squarely on adults. Teachers, of course, through teacher training, pre-service, in-service, teacher competencies, so teachers' own social emotional skills, competencies, and well-being, and the kinds of supports, ongoing supports that are embedded in settings that help teachers do their work the best they can. And it's really not just teachers, because SEL is in every interaction. It's in every social moment. And those don't just happen in classrooms. They happen in all the settings of a school. So it's really about all the school adults. Those who run the lunchroom, those who monitor the halls, those who run the playground. Those are really important interactions that kids have that are very meaningful to their everyday and future well-being. And then finally, it's really impossible to do any of this without thinking carefully about standards. So what are we aiming toward? And then how do we track our progress in ways that are meaningful and inform practice directly? So not necessarily just for accountability purposes, but for reasons that drive into changes in what people do every day in schools and school settings. And that takes us to Clark. Thank you. Sorry.
Good morning. I'd like to try to walk the talk a little bit and do some perspective taking by understanding who you are a little bit better. So can I see a show of hands of people who are university-based researchers or academic people? Show of hands of people who are in government currently? Show of hands of people who are otherwise involved in policy? Show of hands of people who are involved in...
Those are all the advocates.
Okay, all right, okay. Journalists, any journalists out there? Okay, friends of and family of our panelists. I knew it! And back there too. And anyone else I'm missing? Any other roles I'm missing? Yes? Interested people, raise your hand if you're interested in this topic. About half the people out here are interested in what I'm about to say. That's great. Okay. Teachers! Any teachers or people involved in education? Thank you. Any others that I'm missing or neglecting or otherwise insulting? Yes, somebody raised their hand. I don't know what you do, though.
Well, Clark, unfortunately, your 10 minutes is up.
All right. So, so I just want to start by setting a little bit of a context for some of my policy thoughts. I think that the great contest of ideas that's at the heart of our democracy has become kind of a weaponized affair lately, So that's the context for our conversation. Respectful disagreement and compromise seem to have been replaced by contempt and aggression far too often. So what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, I think social emotional skills are critical, and Stephanie defined them beautifully. They're the skills, in my view, that are needed to interact effectively with others and to make and deepen relationships. There are things like perspective taking, social problem solving, self-regulation, and the ability to meet disagreements, for example, with constructive strategies and problem solving. We want this for our children. We also want it in those who are entrusted with our government, and yet it seems to be a moment where public discourse is characterized by anything but social emotional learning. So this volume, this policy piece, this conversation we're having today, in my view, is about how to grow a generation ready to make a more perfect union, not just through their intellects, but through their ability to connect with others positively. So my goal today is to outline some ideas for your consideration about how policy might support this project. And I want to start by just laying out a few assumptions that I'm working with. First is that social emotional skills are consequential. The Future of Children volume reviews evidence to support the premise, and here's what we know in brief. The better developed our children's social emotional skills, the better they do in school and in life. The less likely they are to have mental health and substance abuse problems, and the better their economic and life prospects as adults. A second assumption supported by the evidence is that the development of social emotional skills is influenced by what happens at home, what happens at school, what happens in the community, and what happens in peer groups. A third assumption is, and again supported by evidence, is that we know how to support and nurture social emotional skills through school-based programming. Fourth, programs designed to teach social emotional skills are consistent with broadly accepted goals of schooling because they do a couple of things. They support academic outcomes, and they support constructive citizenship and democratic society. And fifth, I'm assuming that federal, state, and local policy can and should support the expansion of sensible and effective social and emotional learning programming in schools. So those are my assumptions. I think and hope they're uncontroversial. I don't really know. If they are controversial, then we need to talk about what assumptions we're working with. If not, then we can talk about how we might build on those assumptions within policy to make things better for children. So let me summarize some of the important points in the policy brief I wrote, and I'm going to summarize them in two ways. First, I'm going to say how I might envision things were I a policymaker, and if you hadn't guessed by now, I'm not. But recognizing that reasonable people may disagree with my vision, I'm also going to try to step back and state what I think the goal of each of these areas might be, that we can have a robust and constructive discussion, even if it's a disagreement about how to get there, and decide how we might decide to get to how we get to this goal. So really, in the spirit of problem solving, I'm going to try to define 4 problem areas that together we can solve. So again, I'm trying in a small way to model SEL rather than just talk about it by doing social problem solving. So in my view, there are 4 policy directions that could set the stage for measurably improved social emotional outcomes and all the benefits that come with it. First, I would love to see comprehensive pre-K to high school social emotional learning standards that say what children should know and be able to do. Now, I realize that this goal comes with a lot of challenges. What are the right standards? Who sets them? At what level should they be set? Local, state, national? Should schools be beholden to yet another set of standards? If we look at what happened with the Common Core, I think we can anticipate what sorts of challenges there might be to imposing standards on school systems at any level. So the question then is, what broad goal does the idea of social emotional learning standards serve? To me, the problem is this: for educators to move towards common social emotional outcomes for their kids that we all agree are good, it's helpful to have common expectations. And so I ask you and everyone else who influences and cares about policy, how might we find a more perfect solution than national standards to the problem of setting expectations that we can agree on? How might we set clear and measurable expectations that are helpful rather than burdensome, that provide guidance without usurping local control, but that ultimately encourage as many educators as possible to work towards constructive social emotional ends? You know, that's the question, and I think standards is only one answer to those questions. So the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, is already doing outstanding work to help policymakers come to grips with this very question. So I think, you know, it's not as if this is not happening. It's happening fairly vigorously, and I guess the question is, how might we accelerate these efforts to set common expectations by which we can all be moving towards the same goal? Okay, so the second policy thing in my wish list is wanting us to offer incentives for schools and districts to adopt and implement with fidelity evidence-based social emotional learning programs. Now, I know, and I can see from some of the smiles on your faces, that there will be problems with this too. You know, what programs qualify for these incentives? How do we know if the program is sufficiently well implemented? Who's going to monitor and certify the implementation of these programs? What should the incentives be? All right, I get it, okay? I get it. But I would challenge those who are policymakers and those who influence policymakers to consider what kinds of positive incentives might plausibly be integrated into policy that would encourage the adoption of practices that we know work. I'm not a policymaker. I bet everybody in this room has some good ideas about how that could happen. Third, I'd love to see teacher training programs require coursework in social emotional assessment, curriculum, and instruction. All right, I used the word require. Okay, so I know there are going to be problems with that. But if we agree that it's a good idea that our teaching workforce is able to assess and address children's social emotional development, then the question for policymakers is what policy context might stimulate the adoption of more intensive social emotional instruction in teacher training programs. Great work is already underway in this area. Among others, Kim Schoner-Reichel at the University of British Columbia has done really path-breaking work to integrate social emotional learning training into teacher induction programs and has a lot of good thoughts about how that might be done in a way that's positive for everybody. All right, fourth and finally, although we know a lot about what works, we haven't got it all figured out, particularly as social emotional learning goes to scale. So in my view, if we want to keep moving the needle on social emotional learning, we'll need a robust investment in continued research and development. In my opinion, the R&D in SEL should focus on 4 areas. First, we should figure out how to create efficient and scalable methods to nurture children's social emotional development. We've made great progress in that area, but more progress could be made. Second, we should be looking at what kinds of organizational supports at the state, district, and school level are required for SEL programs to routinely take root. I think there's great variability in the extent to which programming actually is done in a rigorous way, so how can we stimulate that? Third, we should be looking at what kinds of systems for continuous improvement can be actually adopted at multiple levels so that it's not just a one and done, I'm adopting this program, but there's continuous reflection and building on the successes that schools are achieving. And fourth, how might we improve our methods of measuring social emotional skills in pre-kindergarten through high school? So are these the right priorities for R&D? I don't know. But the more important thing than whether these are the right priorities or not is that we invest in R&D to make this something that is continually improving. So I leave it to you, hopefully, to debate, should we invest? And if so, what should we invest in? I think there are already examples of this kind of investment going on. Look at the Institute of Education Sciences and the Funders Collaborative for Innovative Measurement. So there, again, in this area, as in the others, there are examples of wonderful work, and so the question is how can we build on those successes and make things even better. So finally, speaking of innovative measurement, that sign says stop, but I'm going to just keep going for 1 minute. Speaking of innovative measurement,
You just lost a minute off your time.
sorry, Tim. So I think there is a pressing need to develop ways to measure SEL. You know, most of us believe that educators would be at a serious disadvantage if they didn't have ways to assess reading and math skills. And, you know, government and industry have invested I don't know how much to develop varied and rigorous instrumentation to measure academic outcomes for varied purposes. The PARCC assessment alone, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to develop that. And that is what was needed to develop it. By comparison, we've invested virtually nothing on SEL assessment, and I think this is a big problem. At all levels of the educational enterprise, from monitoring student progress towards standards to monitoring a specific child's learning, without good assessment, we're really flying blind, which places the whole endeavor, in my view, at profound risk. There's that dramatic streak again, I'm sorry, but it does. I think without good assessment, you know, FAD could reach in and take the rug out from under us. Okay, so I'm gonna stop, even though I'm so tempted to keep going. I'm gonna stop and hand the podium over to Tim. Thank you very much.
Tim Shriver is a graduate of Yale, Catholic University and University of Connecticut, where he earned a PhD in education. He taught for years in the New Haven Public Schools, where he created the Social Development Project, one of the first efforts to integrate social and emotional development into school culture and classroom teaching. He also founded the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL, which has already been referred to several times, and currently co-chairs the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development at the Aspen Institute. It would not be an overstatement to say that Tim has played a central role in developing the field of social and emotional learning in education and society. For his day job, which I doubt takes more than 12 to 14 hours a day, he's the chairman of the Special Olympics, which now involves more than 170 nations, and since 2010, over 1 million children have been involved in the Special Olympics sports programs. In his spare time, Mark has started an ice cream company in Paul Newman style to raise money for charitable contributions. Let me give you a small insight into his values. Go to the website of the Special Olympics. You will need a roadmap and at least 20 minutes or so to find a picture or any mention of Mark Shriver. To say that this is not the way most people in Washington bring themselves to public attention would be a serious understatement. So as Tim comes to the podium, pose this question to yourself. What kind of person does all of the work but eschews the public spotlight? Tim.
Wow. Thank you, Ron. There's so many things I could say about that introduction, but I'll try to suspend those comments, except to say that it is a huge honor to be here on this stage and to be a part of this volume. I think not just because Clark and Stephanie's comments have captured so well the importance of the work, but also because that this audience and this group of people is so critical to the future of this field. I want to thank my mentor and one of the many co-authors in this volume, Roger Weisberg, who has been guiding me for, I won't say how many years, but it's got a 3 in the first digit, and it's a 2-digit number. And many of the other authors, too, who are my mentors, Mark Greenberg, Kim Schonert-Reichel, and Stephanie, more recently, a great leader in the field, and all the people who contributed. It's actually, I would say, an extraordinary volume, and I don't know how many of you have the time to read these volumes cover to cover, but this is an extraordinarily important volume because, as I was saying earlier to Ron, there is this moment here where the question isn't how do we debate or dissect fine arguments, but how do we catalyze broad action? And Clark captured that, I think, quite well. We're at a moment of capturing broad action, and this volume, I think, helps to move that in a very important and catalytic direction. So my exercise, Clark mentioned we should practice social and emotional skills development. My exercise to all of you would be to help me thank my wife of 31 years, because today is our anniversary. So Linda has come. How many people celebrate their anniversary at Brookings? That's the question. So I know all of you are scholars and you eschew, mercantilist incentives and stuff like that. But if you think to yourself, how could I really make a big splash in my career? Here it is. Social and Emotional Learning in Marriage. That is a huge book. So here's the exercise. What's the one skill you think you need in a marriage that comes under either Roger's rubric or Stephanie's rubric or David Yeager's rubric if you've read the volume? What's the one skill? Now you can have 5 seconds since I'm already closing in on my time. 5 seconds to think of the one skill. Yes? Listening. She has that. Yes, she does. Yes. What's that?
Good humor.
Good humor.
Here I go.
Working on that.
Learn how to say yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. That's a male skill that's very hard for men to learn. Anyone else? Yes. Forgiveness. Empathy. Compassion. Very good, Linda, on that. Also, I would say good decision maker. If I had to go back 31 years, I have to give myself some credit for her choices. But happy anniversary. I love you. Still. More. 31 years later. I learned a new term in this volume, hostile attribution bias. I think that's also one to fight during marriage, hostile attribution bias. I never heard that term before. Scott, did you? I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to let somebody, no. Well, I think it means you assume the worst in the other person. You attribute hostility even though you don't have the understanding. Now, you could say this is a room that has hostile attribution bias against the current administration. But actually, it's an interesting question. Do we, does a group like this have that? And how can we overcome it to the extent we do? Because no matter where we sit on the political spectrum, hostile attribution bias is, as Clark pointed out, a problem in the country, not just in schools or not just amongst children. My role today is, I think, to bring some of the practitioner perspective, maybe to take a step back quickly to see the big picture, maybe to recognize the bottom-up nature of this movement, the way in which this is responding in some ways to the demands that are coming from teachers, from principals, from superintendents, and most importantly, from parents and students. It's to, I hope, as Stephanie said earlier, push us toward catalytic action. So I also have slides if they're around. I see Stephanie's. I could just do Stephanie's. Thank you. Okay. I don't know how to switch computers. Do you know?
We have people back there working on it, I'm pretty sure, but I will
Okay.
check just to be sure.
In the meantime,
Here we go.
no,
Aha, thank you.
this is not deducted from my time, by the way.
Oh, yes, it is.
It's locked up. What's that? My wife is telling me to have everybody stretch. If you haven't had coffee, please stand up now. Please stand up now. Please, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. She wants everyone to stretch. I say, yes, ma'am. Right? You can see what it takes to get to 31 years. Stretch. You can applaud in sign language already, as though you want me to finish. Thank you. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Are we rebooting? Yeah. Should I get going? Yeah. Okay. I think we're at a moment of extraordinary possibility. The slide I use sometimes with principals and teachers and superintendents centers on using a little clip from Hamilton. How many of you have seen Hamilton? Roger said you can't use it here because it's not scientific enough, but it's artistic enough. In that moment, in the third or so act, you see the young Alexander Hamilton, an immigrant, a poor man, a group of sort of unruly and unfinished young Americans who challenge themselves with the idea that they're not going to throw away their shot. That despite all the adversity, all the uncertainty, all the ambiguity, all of the overwhelming odds against them, that they're going to rise up, that they're not going to throw away their shot. I believe that right now in education we have such a moment. I think this moment intersects the fields of scholarship, public policy, and practice. This volume captures that. This is not only, though, I would say, a movement or an idea of scholars and educators. It's also a movement of healers and teachers. It's a movement for prophets. It's a movement for people who are standing on the front lines and who see themselves as dreamers. The alternate language suggests not just professional occupation, but deep emotional engagement. Many of us feel that children, schools, and I dare say even the culture itself is asking us to find another gear, asking us to reinvent ourselves in some ways, not just by what we do with kids, not just by skills and competencies, but there we go, but by our hearts and souls invested in a new outcome. Archimedes, it's not an outcome that will be driven by one white guy standing by himself in a place, but you'll be familiar with the idea of a moment at which, with a lever and a place to stand, you can move the world. I know it sounds grandiose, but I believe this is true. My own journey here, very quickly, intersects with the field. I started out in compensatory education, after-school programs, tutoring programs, mentoring programs, and I came to Jim Comer about 5 years into my career, and I asked him, why am I failing so frequently? Why are so many kids not responding? What's the problem? He said, you're missing the point. You're missing the fundamental insight around what education is. And he gave me this idea, that teaching and learning is a relationship. I bring this to the fore because I think we will start to see in these ideas common ground that transcends the differences of approach or position that we'll see in the volume. And I think that's important not to overlook the differences, but to give us a pathway forward. Teaching and learning is a relationship. It is fundamentally developmental. Jim went on to do this exercise for me when I was 25 years old. He said, what's the difference? What's the difference between these two shapes to a child who's 4 or 5 or 6 years old? Is one more inherently interesting? Is one more powerful? Is one more engaging? No difference in the shapes, except one. A significant adult wants the child to learn the meaning of shape 1 and doesn't care about the child learning the meaning of shape 2. So the child is fundamentally incentivized, motivated. The neuroscience is supporting this. I don't have time to go into it. But the neuroscience is supporting that learning begins in a social context and is sustained by social relationships. Meaning making is driven by the interaction between human beings, not by the fundamentally fascinating dimensions of the content itself. So if Jim gave me what I think was, at least for me, a transformative insight, Roger came along, so teaching and learning is not, this is the paradigm that's still operative. Now, we can dismiss it and poo-poo it and believe that it's way antiquated. But most of our educational practices and policies operate on the idea that teaching and learning is a mechanical transfer of facts to a machine. The facts are created in a laboratory, they're bound in a supply chain, they're distributed by trucks and this kind of stuff, and they're handed to the end of the supply chain, which is the teacher, and the teacher then hands the product to the consumer and bolts it onto their brain. That's the model that still exists. Roger comes along and says, well, not only is education development, but there are ways to promote development. And introduces me and many educators, he and his colleagues, to the idea that we didn't just have to recognize that development is education, as Stephanie pointed out, but that there were ways to advance development in the social and emotional context. So this framework sees many different manifestations, and David dismisses it a little bit as skills instruction when you get to later adolescence. Early childhood article in here reinforces the power of these skills instructions when matched to developmental periods, as Stephanie pointed out. But the fundamental insight here for me was not only could we reshape the paradigm and the whole concept of what it meant to educate a child around relationships, but we could also have skills to actually move the ball forward. Now, Jim adds one other important insight in this conversation, and that is that education used to, 5 minutes, are you kidding me? Jeez. Education used to be rooted in a broad culture where meaning making was assumed. So if we go back to traditional cultures, almost no one had formal education, but everybody had rites of passage, everybody had a context for making meaning. Religion and ritual provided systems in which children could grow and understand their larger role in the world. Art and music provided creative energy in which children could learn and understand that their creative impulses could be exercised. Formal schooling comes along, matching instruction in academic content into a cultural context. But 100 years later, you see Dewey, Montessori, and others starting to fight to preserve the cultural context and social relationships as they become pulled out of schooling. And when you get to Sputnik and A Nation at Risk and No Child Left Behind, the dialogue has almost completely decontextualized learning outside of culture at the same time that culture begins to collapse and meaning-making collapses in the broader context. So as children lose cultural norms, lose religious and meaning-making norms, lose boundaries and parameters that the culture used to provide, the school doesn't provide it either, and children, what do we find? To me, the primary diagnosis of the problem disengagement, no meaning. They don't care. The dates of the Civil War don't matter to them. How to punctuate a sentence has no meaning. The periodic table is irrelevant. It doesn't matter to me. That's what kids are saying to us. Not because it doesn't matter, but because we haven't shown them. The relationships, the interior desire, the desire to dream, to matter, to belong, to fit in doesn't connect with them to the academic content that we have disembodied and made meaningless in many ways. Why is this volume important? I gotta go so fast now, it's not even funny. This is just fun. I put this up for my wife so she'd remember. This is neuroscience, by the way. And it's really, it's a summary of a lot of neuroscience, and I don't know neuroscience, but I can understand this. If you need evidence to support the idea that this is important, I think that's probably the best picture I've seen so far. So let me just say one quick thing about this graph. This volume, if you read it closely, might lead you to believe that there's a difference of opinion between people who believe that we ought to teach things like problem solving and people who believe we ought to focus on teachers who teach it and people who believe we ought to focus on context and mindsets and people who believe we ought to focus on community-based organizations, discipline practices, and teacher education. As though those were distinguishable in the work of promoting an education that is relational. They're not. There are no either-ors in that sentence. None. I am fully convinced, and this is, as I would say, as a practitioner who tried to do the integrative work, I spent as much time with parents using problem-solving posters that Roger provided as we did with teachers, more than we did with kids. 25 years ago, linked school instruction in problem solving to primary mental health team projects where we could teach kids help seeking so they could access what we didn't have the language, tier 2 and tier 3 resources 30 years ago. There are no either ors. We have falsely broken the field into silos. If there's one message I hope comes through the whole volume is that the silos should be broken down. So here's my little tribute to this challenge. This first framework here at the top is what we used to describe when we were talking about primary prevention, that there was all this policy, Clark, and this is something not addressed in your brief as I see it, but there is policy that does force siloing in schools. It's bad policy. It focuses on symptom-related, reactive strategies that schools are not good at implementing, instead of focusing on development. Now, you can see in the bottom box, if you just look right on top of Clark's head as though he were wearing a nice top hat, you see the new framework is the Coordinated Weisberg-Jones Consensus. I'm introducing this, okay? So Roger says it's easier for scholars to share a toothbrush than to agree on conceptual work. But I'm putting down my stake in the ground right now that Weisberg-Jones, Stephanie teases out the distinctions between their frameworks, and I won't go into all the details there, but for the practitioners, honestly speaking, we don't care. Sorry to say, we don't really care. We just want it to be right, evidence-based, and clear. So figuring out the distinctions is a critical scholarly task, but it has to get done quickly. We can't afford to have 15, 20 scholars coming at educators from multiple directions. Why? Because they become powerless to act. They cannot make those distinctions. If the scholarly community doesn't make them, we undermine our capacity to make a difference for kids. So here's just a quick example. This can be done. This is just one elementary school in Chicago. They've taken Roger's framework, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, and they have sorted all of their social and emotional learning interventions into the 5 competency areas. Nothing fancy, no PhDs involved, no public policy needed to force it, no requirements and mandates to demand it, just competent school-based educators who are de-siloing this work and trying to promote a developmental framework. So, and there are other examples of this, and then I'm going to wrap up. Don't even show me the sign. This is the Massachusetts State Standards that refers to the idea that mathematics instruction should be social and emotional learning driven, that self-awareness and self-management and relationship skills and decision-making can be taught in math. So we can teach the skills explicitly and we can infuse them. Do we have to choose? Of course not. It's not education if you choose. So this is current. This is 2017. Here's the Aspen Institute framework that shows the complexity of this. Here are the influencers in the world of education. Now, picture yourself as one of those heads in the middle. That's a teacher for the most part. You see parents and children there. But those are the multiple levels of influence and power over what goes on in a school. I'm sorry to say there is no shortcut to the explicit work necessary to de-silo that entire fan of people and get them to reverse their personal ideological agendas and help them focus in a coordinated way across all those different boxes on development. Not time to go into it all. Here's the Illinois standards. Here's Castle's new framework that attempts to support district-level leaders and principals in the de-siloing project. You can look at the website. Again, obviously no time to go into it now. Here's my final point. We're living in a very uncertain time. The country is unstable when it comes to common purpose, if you ask me at least. We're searching for new frameworks. I believe that our key issues point towards this moment of opportunity for schools. Keep in mind, this country has been led by schools in the past. Between 1910 and 1950, we multiplied the number of people going to high school in this country 5 times. Only 10% of Americans went to high school in 1910. Over 70% graduated high school by 1970. That shift in the way in which we conceptualize schooling did as much to advance the economic interests of this country as, in my view, almost any other shift, almost unnoticed. Schools can be the centerpiece of a new paradigm. The country's exhausted by the policy discussions we have now. Teachers are asking for this. More than 90% believe they need more, and their students need more support for social and emotional learning. The data is in this volume. Stephanie referenced it. I didn't obviously go through it. There's a broad cultural shift, too. When we were kids, most of us, all the books in the world were at the Library of Congress. Today, they're in your pocket, right? So kids don't need us the way they used to need us. They need us much more for inspiration than they do for information. The last part is the part this journal is about, I believe. We have a lot of new entrants in this field. We have the chance to align them. But it is not a certain chance. It is not certain that we will succeed. The success of this field, however, hinges on whether or not we do. We're on this is Edge Research. We are on the radar across the country. One of the reasons why this journal is so important. We are also on the radar for businesses. We have some new bedfellows. The alignment, what businesses are telling us, whether you talk to Google or whether you talk to the Business Roundtable, teamwork, communication, respect, dependability, integrity, initiative, these are the new skills for the 21st century. We have a purple movement. Also, this is from Stephanie's recent article where she went through the naming challenges. But I circled this in red and blue so you can see that some of this language will appeal more to people who come at this more conservatively, whereas other language will appeal to people who come at this from more progressive points of view. But we don't have to pick. There is common ground here, which is, I think, an enormously important issue. So to me, the summary point is this. It's education is development, or we're practicing malpractice. We don't have that terminology in education, but as far as I'm concerned, as a practitioner, looking at the research for almost 30 years, it's no longer an open question. Either we shift toward a developmental framework or we are guilty of malpractice. In closing, just let me say that I think we have to change the narrative. I think this volume does a lot towards doing that. I think we have to go from information to inspiration, from tests to development, from a focus on schools as those schools were embodied institutions to a focus on schools and families and communities. This is not just a rhetorical challenge, but it's also a scientific challenge and it's a policy challenge. We have a lot of advocates to change the conversation. Here's one that most people know, maybe because of happy. But here's the point. We're no longer just talking to ourselves. The culture is talking to us. This is Pharrell Williams. You have to choose what side you're on. I'm choosing, listen to the language, empathy. I'm choosing inclusion. He is articulating a vision for what school can become. Divisiveness does work, but we have to choose what side we're on. But we could also get our inspiration from our own students. This is a 10-year-old in Chicago, Melanie Garcia. Here's what she wrote in preparation for her presentation to the school board on social and emotional learning. Just because I'm sensitive, I'm not dramatic, I'm not fragile, I'm not weak, I'm emotionally intelligent. 10 years old. 10 years old, already there. Just because I'm smart, I'm not lonely, I'm not a loser, I'm not awkward, I'm not a nerd. Listen to the culture talking to her. Listen to the culture talking to her, and listen to her standing up to the culture. I'm intelligent. Just because I'm 10, I'm not immature. This is the school talking to her. I'm not helpless, I'm not worthless, I'm young. Now what? Right? Just because I'm a girl, I'm not just worried about my looks, I'm not bad at sports, I'm not weak, I am me. You have a child who has shaped an identity that is resilient, that is strong, that is driven by an internal compass, that is embedded in a social context, that is eager to learn. This child will learn. No labels necessary. We don't have to go to at-risk or minority or low-income or Chicago or urban or violent neighborhood, whatever labels you want to use. This is a competent child ready to learn and eager for us to make the school a place where she wants and will fit in. David Brooks's piece last week, some of you may have seen it on Paradigms in the Culture, closes by saying that libertarianism, globalization, multiculturalism, America first, mercantilist, talented, he goes through these paradigms and he closes by saying, in the community where talent and education are valued as the new unifying force in the country, the poor boy or girl are enmeshed in care and cultivation. Everything is designed to arouse energy and propel social mobility. Arouse energy and propel social mobility. I think if those were our measures of success, we would be able to fulfill what this volume invites us to do, which is to advance the research, practice, and policy to a point where we're using education to move the country. Thank you. Sorry for going on.